The cafe on Willow Lane was the kind of place you might walk past without a second thought. Its brick facade, modest sign, and flower boxes under the windows didn't shout for attention. Instead, it invited people in with its quiet charm. Inside, the wooden floors creaked softly underfoot, and sunlight filtered through lace curtains, casting delicate patterns on the tables. The air smelled of freshly ground coffee, buttery pastries, and a hint of lavender from a vase near the counter. It was the kind of spot where the regulars knew each other by name, where conversations were kept low out of respect for the soothing atmosphere. The clink of spoons against ceramic cups and the occasional rustle of newspapers were the loudest sounds most mornings. In a corner booth, partially tucked away from the main floor, sat an older man. His weathered face told 1,000 untold stories, with lines etched deeply into his forehead and around his mouth. His gray hair, neatly combed, caught the sunlight, giving it a faint silver sheen. He wore a simple jacket over a pressed shirt, and his movements were unhurried as he raised his teacup to his lips. To anyone passing by, he seemed like just another retiree. Maybe he was a grandfather enjoying a quiet moment, or someone reminiscing about old times. People barely noticed him. He seemed to prefer it that way. But if anyone had looked closer, they might have felt a flicker of something else, an energy about him, subtle but undeniable. His eyes were sharp, scanning the room with a precision that didn't fit the picture of a peaceful retiree. Every detail seemed to register in his mind, the way the barista smiled politely but was more tired than usual, the way a man near the counter shifted uncomfortably as if he had a lot on his mind, and the faint creak of the door as a couple entered, their footsteps uneven. This wasn't a man who simply watched the world go by. He observed, catalogued, and assessed. Then the peace was shattered. The distant rumble of engines grew louder, shaking the windows slightly. A moment later, the door burst open, and in came a group of bikers, their laughter cutting through the quiet like a blade. They strode in as if they owned the place, their boots thudding against the wooden floor. The leader walked in first, a tall, burly man with a shaved head and tattoos crawling up his neck like ivy on a brick wall. His leather jacket was covered in patches, each one a symbol of something, maybe loyalty, maybe violence. He scanned the room with a look that dared anyone to challenge his presence. Behind him, his crew followed. They were a mismatched group, one with a thick beard and a gut that stretched his jacket, another with a mohawk that seemed to defy gravity, and a younger one who looked like he was trying too hard to fit in. Despite their differences, they all moved with the same swagger, their confidence fueled by the group's strength. The cafe seemed to shrink under their presence. Conversations stopped mid-sentence, and heads turned, some in fear, others in irritation. The barista froze for a moment, her hand trembling as she placed a coffee cup on the counter. The older man in the corner didn't move. He took another sip of his tea, his eyes still scanning, but now with a slight shift in focus. The bikers hadn't done anything yet, but their loud voices and cocky laughter filled the space like an unspoken threat. The leader's gaze swept the room, taking in the nervous customers and the uneasy staff. His smirk widened. He thrived on this kind of reaction. He thrived on making people feel small. Then his eyes landed on the older man. There was something about him that caught the leader's attention. Maybe it was the way he sat so still, so unaffected, while everyone else seemed on edge. Maybe it was the way he didn't bother to look up, as if their arrival didn't matter to him. "This'll be fun," the leader muttered, a sinister grin spreading across his face. He took a step forward, his boots hitting the floor with deliberate force. Behind him, his crew spread out, claiming tables as if they were staking territory. One of them knocked over a chair, laughing loudly as it clattered to the ground. Still, the older man didn't react. The leader's grin faded slightly. He didn't like being ignored. He motioned for one of his crew to follow him as he walked toward the corner booth. The older man set his cup down, his movements deliberate and calm. For the first time, he looked up, his eyes meeting the leader's. The leader stopped for a moment, caught off guard by the intensity in those eyes. They weren't the eyes of a man who scared easily. They weren't the eyes of someone who would back down. But the leader didn't let that deter him. He was used to being the one in control, and he wasn't about to let some old guy ruin his fun. "Hey there, Grandpa," he said, his voice loud and mocking. "You look like you could use some company." The cafe held its breath. The older man's face remained unreadable. He glanced briefly at the leader, as if sizing him up, then turned his attention back to his tea. It wasn't fear, it was something else entirely, something that made the leader pause for half a second. But then, brushing off the strange feeling, the leader pulled a chair from a nearby table and sat down across from the older man, leaning back like he owned the place. "Quiet little spot, huh?" the leader said, his voice dripping with mockery. "Bet you come here every day, sipping your tea, reading your papers. Living the dream, aren't you?" The man's expression didn't change. He took a slow sip, setting his cup down gently before answering. "It's a good place," he said, his tone neutral. "Nice people, good tea." The leader chuckled, nudging his buddy beside him. "Hear that? Nice people. Real cozy." He leaned forward suddenly, resting his elbows on the table and staring into the man's face. "But you see, Grandpa, it's a little too quiet for my taste. Don't you think it could use a bit of excitement?" The older man met his gaze, his own eyes calm but firm. "Excitement doesn't always end well," he said quietly. The leader blinked. For a moment, he felt as though those words carried more weight than they should have. But he wasn't about to let himself be outdone by someone who looked like they'd stepped out of a history book. "Is that right?" he asked, his tone hardening. He reached across the table, picking up the man's spoon and spinning it between his fingers. "Well, lucky for you, we're here to liven things up." Behind him, his crew had started to make themselves more at home. One of them was rifling through the magazine rack by the door, tossing publications carelessly onto the floor. Another had cornered the barista, leaning over the counter with a grin that made her step back uneasily. A third was fiddling with the radio behind the counter, switching through stations until the static buzzed loudly, disrupting the tranquil cafe atmosphere. The customers who hadn't already left sat frozen in their seats, unsure of what to do. A couple in the corner whispered nervously to each other, glancing at the door as if calculating the odds of slipping out unnoticed. The older man noticed all of this. His eyes flicked briefly to the barista, then to the frightened customers. But he didn't move. Not yet. The leader noticed his glance and laughed. "Oh, don't worry about them," he said, gesturing vaguely to the room. "We're just here to have a little fun. Nobody's getting hurt unless they make things difficult." The man tilted his head slightly, studying the leader. "And what kind of fun are you looking for?" he asked. The leader smirked. "The kind that shakes things up. You know, makes life a little more interesting." He leaned closer, his voice dropping. "But if you're asking, maybe you'd like to join in. Or, are you just gonna sit there and sip your tea while the world moves around you?" The older man's hand rested lightly on the table, his fingers tracing the edge of his cup. He didn't answer right away, letting the silence stretch just long enough to make the leader shift uncomfortably. Finally, he spoke. "I've seen a lot of things in my time," he said. "Enough to know when trouble's looking for a fight it doesn't want." The leader's grin faltered for a fraction of a second before returning, wider and more forced this time. "You think I don't want this fight?" he said, his voice rising slightly. "You don't know a thing about me, old man." The older man nodded slowly, his expression unchanging. "And you don't know a thing about me." The air in the cafe seemed to grow heavier. Even the bikers who were busy with their antics paused briefly, sensing that something had shifted. The leader stared at the older man, his grin fading completely now. "Who are you, Exactly, he asked, his tone more serious than before. The man didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached for his tea, taking one last sip before setting the empty cup down. He leaned back in his seat, his gaze never leaving the leaders. Just someone who knows when to pick a fight, he said. And when to walk away. The leader's eyes narrowed. He didn't like the way this man talked, the calmness, the certainty. It felt like a challenge, and he wasn't used to being challenged. Is that supposed to scare me? He asked, his voice dripping with sarcasm. Because let me tell you something, old man. Before he could finish, one of his crew called out from the counter. Hey, boss, check this out. The leader turned, annoyed by the interruption, and saw the younger biker holding something in his hand. It was a small, leather-bound notebook that had been sitting on the counter near the cash register. What's that? The leader asked, getting up from his chair. The biker flipped through the pages, his brow furrowing. It's like a logbook or something. It's got names and dates and... I don't know, man, it looks official. The older man's eyes flicked to the notebook, and for the first time, his expression hardened. Put that down, he said, his voice low but commanding. The biker froze for a moment, startled by the sudden change in tone. Then he smirked, holding the notebook up like a trophy. What's the big deal, old man? It's just some boring book. I said, put it down, the man repeated, his voice even sharper now. The leader stepped in, snatching the notebook from his crew member's hand and flipping through it himself. His expression changed as he read the pages, his eyes darting back and forth. What is this? He muttered, more to himself than anyone else. The older man stood up slowly, his movements deliberate. The room seemed to hold its breath again as he stepped forward, his gaze locked on the leader. That, he said, is none of your business. The leader looked up, his eyes narrowing as realization dawned. You're not just some old guy, are you? The older man didn't answer. He simply stood there, his presence suddenly more imposing than anyone in the room could have imagined. The cafe staff tensed as the group of bikers took over, their presence like a storm rolling into a peaceful valley. They moved through the space without care or respect, dragging chairs noisily, kicking over an innocent display of pastries, and sending sugar packets skidding across the counter. The air, once calm and welcoming, was now charged with unease. A young server, barely out of her teens, tried to pick up the scattered pastries. Her hands shook as she worked, avoiding the mocking glances of the burly men towering over her. One of the bikers, a wiry man with a scruffy beard, flicked a sugar packet at her. It hit her shoulder and fell to the ground, but the act was enough to make her flinch. Hey, don't forget to smile, he sneered, grinning as his crew erupted into laughter. The older man in the corner noticed everything. His teacup rested in his hand, but his gaze was now focused, sharp. He saw the barista at the counter, gripping the edge so tightly her knuckles turned white. He saw the couple near the window, whispering to each other in hushed tones, their eyes darting nervously to the door. And he saw the bikers, how they moved, how they talked, the way their leader strutted around like a rooster in a henhouse. But he didn't flinch. He didn't shift or frown. He simply sat there, his posture relaxed but alert, as if he were waiting for something. This lack of reaction didn't sit well with the leader. A man like him thrived on fear and discomfort. It was how he asserted his dominance, how he made sure everyone knew he was in charge. Yet here was this old man, sipping tea like nothing had changed. The leader sauntered over, his heavy boots thudding against the wooden floor with deliberate force. He leaned down, placing both hands on the older man's table, invading his space with a sneer. Hey, old man, he growled, his voice low but threatening. This your regular spot? Looks a little too quiet for someone like me. What do you say we spice things up? The older man didn't answer right away. Instead, he took his time, setting his cup down gently on the saucer and folding his hands in front of him. Finally, he looked up, meeting the leader's gaze with calm, steady eyes. "I'm just here for my tea," he said simply. His tone was even, almost indifferent, as if he hadn't noticed the tension radiating from the man towering over him. The leader straightened up, laughing loudly. "Tea," he repeated, turning to his crew. "You hear that, boys? Grandpa here thinks he's in some fancy joint, sipping tea and minding his business. Maybe we should show him how we do things." The crew chuckled, egging their boss on. "You're awful quiet for someone sitting in my cafe," the leader added, his voice turning darker. "You see, we don't like quiet. Quiet's boring." The older man tilted his head slightly, his expression unreadable. "Didn't realize this was your cafe," he replied, his voice still calm. The leader's grin faltered for a moment, then returned wider. "Everything's mine if I want it to be," he said, his chest puffing out. He reached over and grabbed the older man's teacup, inspecting it as if mocking its simplicity. "Tea," he muttered, shaking his head. "Not even coffee. What's wrong, Grandpa? Too much caffeine for you?" The older man didn't reply. He watched, his gaze steady, as the leader tilted the cup and let the remaining tea spill onto the table. The room seemed to hold its breath. "That was unnecessary," the man said quietly, his tone still calm but with an edge that hadn't been there before. The leader leaned closer, his grin now more of a sneer. "Unnecessary? You don't get to tell me what's necessary, old man." He straightened up, spreading his arms wide. "In case you haven't noticed, we're running the show now." Behind him, one of the bikers had started fiddling with the cafe's radio, switching stations with loud, obnoxious clicks until the static buzzed through the speakers. Another had grabbed a chair and spun it around, sitting backward and watching the scene unfold with a smirk. The tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife. The older man exhaled slowly, his eyes briefly scanning the room again. His gaze landed on the young server, now standing frozen with her tray in hand, and on the barista, who was glancing nervously at the door as if debating whether to make a run for it. The leader noticed his wandering eyes and stepped closer, snapping his fingers to draw the man's attention. "Hey, I'm talking to you," he barked. The older man looked back at him, his expression still unreadable. "You've made your point," he said, his voice steady. "Now maybe you should leave while you can." The leader's eyes widened slightly, then narrowed. For the first time, he hesitated, as though some part of him recognized the weight of those words. But the hesitation was brief, quickly replaced by anger. "Leave," he repeated, laughing harshly. "You're giving me orders now? That's cute. Real cute. Let me tell you how this works, old man. I decide when we leave. And right now, we're just getting started." The man said nothing, his calm demeanor unshaken. The leader turned to his crew. "Let's make things interesting," he said, his grin returning. He motioned to one of the bikers near the counter. "Grab something. Let's see how much Grandpa's willing to lose." The biker nodded, smirking as he reached for a ceramic teapot displayed on a nearby shelf. He held it up, inspecting it like it was a prize, before turning back to the leader. "Think this'll do?" he asked, grinning. The older man's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, but his eyes remained locked on the leader. "That teapot belongs to the cafe," he said, his tone low but firm. "Put it back." The leader laughed again, though it sounded more forced this time. "Or what?" he challenged. The older man didn't answer right away. He stood slowly, his movements deliberate and controlled, as if he had all the time in the world. For the first time, his full height became apparent. Though not as tall as the leader, he carried himself with a presence that made him seem larger. Or you'll regret it, he said simply. The words hung in the air, heavy and charged. The leader's grin faded completely now, replaced by a scowl. He stepped closer, standing nose to nose with the older man. "You've got a lot of nerve," he growled. "And you've got a lot to lose," the man replied, his voice calm but filled with a quiet authority that seemed to cut through the noise. The bikers, who had been laughing and joking just moments ago, fell silent. Even the one holding the teapot lowered it slightly, suddenly unsure. The leader glanced back at his crew, then at the older man, his scowl deepening. "You think you're tough?" he asked, his voice low. "You think you scare me?" The man didn't answer. He didn't need to. The cafe seemed to shrink under the weight of the standoff. The older man stood still, his gaze locked onto the leader's face, unblinking. Around them, the other patrons dared not move, their breaths shallow as they clung to the edges of their seats. The leader took another step closer, his towering frame attempting to intimidate. His sneer widened, but it lacked the confidence it had before. This man, this quiet, unassuming man, wasn't reacting the way everyone else did. No flinching. No pleading. Nothing. "You've got some attitude," the leader said, his voice quieter now but no less venomous. "Maybe I need to teach you how things work around here." The older man tilted his head slightly, studying the leader as if weighing his options. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm but carried an unmistakable edge. "You've already shown me how things work for people like you." "People like me," the leader repeated, his scowl deepening. "You think you know who I am?" "I don't need to," the older man replied. "I've seen enough." The tension rippled outward, spreading through the room like a shockwave. One of the bikers shifted uncomfortably, glancing at the door as if considering an exit. Another fidgeted with the chain around his neck, his bravado starting to crack under the pressure. The leader, however, wasn't ready to back down. His pride was on the line now, and he wasn't about to let some old man in a quiet cafe make him look weak. He turned to his crew, barking out orders. "You! Grab that plate over there. And you see if there's anything in the register worth taking." The barista gasped, stepping back instinctively as one of the bikers made his way toward the counter. "Please don't," she said, her voice trembling. The older man's eyes flicked to her, then back to the leader. "That's enough," he said firmly. The leader turned back to him, his grin returning. "Or what?" The older man didn't answer right away. He took a step forward, closing the distance between them, and lowered his voice so only the leader could hear. "Walk away," he said. "While you still can." The leader's face twitched, a mix of anger and confusion crossing his features. This man didn't look dangerous. He didn't look like someone who could back up the threat implied in his words. But there was something in his tone, something in the way he carried himself, that made the leader hesitate. For a moment, it seemed like he might back down. But then, one of his crew shouted from behind the counter. "Boss! There's a safe back here." The leader's hesitation vanished, replaced by a new wave of arrogance. He turned to the older man, his grin now almost feral. "Looks like we're not going anywhere after all." He motioned for one of his bikers to join the man at the counter, but before they could take another step, the older man moved. It wasn't dramatic. He didn't shout or make a scene. He simply reached out and grabbed the leader's wrist. The room went still. The leader froze, his expression shifting from cocky to shocked as he looked down at the hand gripping him. The older man's grip wasn't hard, but it was firm, unrelenting. "You don't want to do this," the older man said quietly. The leader yanked his arm, but the grip didn't budge. Panic flickered in his eyes for the briefest moment. "Let go," he growled. "Not until you listen," the man replied. For the first time, a hint of the storm beneath the older man's calm exterior began to show. His voice, still low, carried a force that seemed to echo through the room. "You came in here looking for trouble," he said. "But you didn't think about what might happen if you found it?" The leader's bravado faltered. His crew exchanged uncertain glances, their confidence waning as the scene unfolded. "Who are you?" the leader asked, his voice cracking slightly. The older man released his grip and stepped back, his gaze steady. "Just someone who's seen what happens when people push too far." The leader rubbed his wrist, glaring at the man but saying nothing. "Take your crew," the older man continued, "and walk out that door. If you don't, I can't promise you'll like what happens next." The challenge hung in the air, daring the leader to respond. But for the first time, he seemed at a loss for words. His confidence, so unshakable moments ago, had been replaced by a growing sense of unease. One of the bikers, a younger man with a nervous energy, stepped forward. "Maybe we should go, boss," he muttered, glancing at the door. The leader turned on him, his anger flaring. "Shut up," he snapped. But the damage was done. The crew was losing faith in their leader, and the older man knew it. "You don't belong here," the older man said, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "This place isn't for people like you. Go find somewhere else to be tough." The leader's jaw tightened, his pride battling with his instincts. He knew he was being challenged, but something about this man made him hesitate. The barista, who had been watching from behind the counter, took a small step forward. "Please," she said, her voice quiet but steady. "Just leave." The leader's gaze flicked to her, then back to the older man. He let out a harsh laugh, trying to regain some semblance of control. "Fine," he said finally, raising his hands in mock surrender. "We're leaving. But this isn't over." He turned to his crew, motioning for them to follow. The bikers hesitated for a moment, then began to shuffle toward the door, their bravado gone. As the last of them filed out, the leader paused in the doorway, looking back at the older man. "I'll see you around," he said, his tone a mix of threat and uncertainty. The older man didn't respond. He simply watched as the door closed behind them, the tension in the room dissolving like a popped balloon. The barista let out a shaky breath, her shoulders sagging with relief. "Thank you," she whispered. The older man nodded, his expression softening. Just doing what needed to be done. The cafe slowly returned to normal, the customers resuming their conversations in hushed tones. But the older man remained standing, his eyes fixed on the door as if expecting something or someone. The co-worker froze mid-motion, the coffee cup she was carrying wobbling precariously on the tray. Her eyes darted toward the older man, and then back to her friend, disbelief written across her face. "You mean that John Grant?" she whispered. "The one who? SHH." The waitress raised a hand, cutting her off. Her eyes flicked nervously toward the bikers, who were now leaning over a table of frightened teenagers, cracking crude jokes at their expense. "Yes, that John Grant. But don't say his name too loud. If they figure it out." She trailed off, glancing back at the man in the corner booth. To anyone else, he still looked like an ordinary retiree, sipping his tea, completely unbothered by the chaos around him. But to the waitress, it was clear now, his calm wasn't indifference. It was control. Meanwhile, the leader of the bikers had shifted his focus back to the older man. It was eating away at him the way this man refused to flinch, refused to acknowledge his attempts at dominance. To someone like the leader, who thrived on fear and submission, this was a direct challenge. "Hey, Grandpa," the leader barked, his voice cutting through the hum of the cafe. "You haven't even said thank you for the entertainment." "You're welcome, by the way." The older man didn't respond. He set his teacup down, carefully, deliberately, and glanced at the clock on the wall. The leader's grin faltered, just slightly, before he covered it with more bravado. "What's the matter? Cat got your tongue?" He slapped the nearest table for emphasis, causing the couple sitting there to jump in their seats. Still, the man said nothing. The waitress exchanged a glance with her co-worker, panic bubbling just beneath the surface. She knew the stories. John Grant wasn't a man who needed words to make his presence known. If he was keeping quiet, it wasn't out of fear, it was because he was waiting. Watching. Calculating. But the bikers didn't know that. One of them, emboldened by the leader's antics, decided to join in. He grabbed a nearby chair and spun it around, plopping down directly across from the older man. "Kman, buddy," he drawled. "You're not even gonna crack a smile? Lighten up a little." The older man lifted his gaze, slowly, meeting the biker's eyes for the first time. The intensity of his stare was so sharp, so unyielding, that the younger man froze for a moment, his grin faltering. "You don't belong here," John Grant said quietly, his voice low but firm. The biker blinked, taken aback. "What? This cafe? This town? This place where people come to feel safe? You don't belong here." The leader stepped forward, his hands curling into fists. "Oh, and you think you do, old man? You think you're the sheriff around here?" John didn't answer. Instead, he turned his gaze back to his tea, lifting the cup to his lips and taking a measured sip. That was the breaking point. The leader slammed his fist onto John's table, rattling the dishes and spilling the tea slightly over the edge of the saucer. "Enough of this quiet act," he roared. "You think you're better than me? Huh? Say something." John set his cup down and looked up at the leader, his face calm but his eyes unrelenting. "You talk too much," he said simply. The room seemed to hold its breath. The leader snarled, grabbing the edge of John's table and flipping it over with a loud crash. The sound of shattering porcelain echoed through the cafe as the tea and dishes hit the floor. Gasps erupted from the other patrons, and a baby in the corner started crying. For a moment, John sat perfectly still, his lap now covered in spilled tea. Then, with a measured movement, he stood, brushing himself off as if the chaos didn't faze him in the slightest. The leader took a step back, his bravado faltering under the weight of John's unwavering stare. "I gave you a chance to leave," John said, his voice steady but carrying a quiet menace. "Now you've made it personal." The leader laughed nervously, trying to shake off the creeping sense of dread. "What are you gonna do, old man? Call the cops? You think I'm scared of a little authority?" "You should be," John replied. That's when one of the younger bikers noticed the tattoo on John's wrist. He squinted at it, his brow furrowing in recognition. "Boss," he said, tugging on the leader's sleeve. "I think we should go." The leader shoved him off. "Shut up, Kevin. I've got this." "No, boss, I'm serious," the younger biker insisted, his voice rising in urgency. "That tattoo, it's a badge number. This guy's a cop, or he was." The room went deathly silent. All eyes turned to John Grant. The leader stared at the tattoo, then back at John's face. "You're lying," he said, but his voice wavered. The younger biker shook his head. "No, man, I've seen it before. That's the badge number from that big case years ago. The one with the syndicate. The guy who took them down, he's a legend." The leader's bravado shattered. His smirk disappeared, replaced by a look of disbelief and fear. "You're telling me this guy, this old man, is John Grant?" John didn't say a word. He didn't need to. The slight tilt of his head, the way he stood with his hands loose but ready, said it all. The leader took an unsteady step back. His crew was watching him now, their loyalty wavering as they realized the magnitude of the situation. I don't care who he is," the leader stammered, his voice rising in desperation. "He's just one guy. We can take him. but deep down, he wasn't so sure anymore. The leader's voice wavered as he tried to muster his confidence. His crew shifted uneasily, stealing glances at one another. The once unshakable bravado of their gang was crumbling under the weight of a single man's presence. "You don't get it, boss," the younger biker, Kevin, pressed, his tone bordering on panic. "This isn't just some old guy. He's the one who took down the Black Vipers. Remember them? The crew that ran the whole East Coast until they got wiped out? That was him." The leader's jaw tightened. "Shut up, Kevin," he barked. But the damage was done. The murmurs among the other bikers grew louder, their unease spreading like wildfire. One of the older bikers, a grizzled man with a scar running down his cheek, stepped closer to the leader. His voice was low but firm. "Boss, maybe we should listen to the kid. If this guy's who he says he is, we don't want any part of this." The leader whipped around to face him, his frustration boiling over. "What's wrong with you people? He's just a washed-up old man. You really think he can take all of us?" The scarred biker didn't answer right away. His gaze flicked to John, who was still standing calmly amidst the chaos, his eyes steady and unyielding. "I think he doesn't need to," the scarred man said finally. "Look at him. He's not scared of us. That should tell you something." The leader turned back to John, his fists clenching and unclenching. He was cornered, and he knew it. If he backed down now, his crew would see him as weak. But if he pushed forward, there was a chance, just a chance, that the stories about John Grant were true. John spoke then, his voice cutting through the room like a knife. "You're at a crossroads," he said, his tone calm but carrying an unmistakable authority. "You can take what's left of your pride and walk out of here. Or you can push your luck and see where it gets you." The leader bristled. "You think you're some kind of hero, don't you?" he snarled. "Walking around with your little badge tattoo, acting like you're untouchable." John didn't rise to the bait. "I think I'm someone who's seen what happens when people make the wrong choices. And I think you're smarter than you look." The leader's face twisted in rage. He grabbed a chair and hurled it across the room, where it smashed against the wall. "You don't tell me what to do," he shouted. "I run this show." But even as he spoke, it was clear his control was slipping. His voice was too loud, too desperate. His crew wasn't looking at him anymore, they were looking at John. One of the younger bikers stepped forward hesitantly. "Boss, maybe we should just..." "Enough," the leader roared, silencing him. He turned back to John, his eyes blazing with fury. "You think you're so tough? Prove it." John sighed, the faintest hint of weariness crossing his features. "I've got nothing to prove," he said. "Coward," the leader spat, taking a step closer. But John didn't move. Instead, he tilted his head slightly, his gaze sharpening. "You know what's funny," he said, his voice deceptively light. "I've met men like you before. Men who think shouting makes them strong. Men who think fear is the same as respect." The leader froze, caught off guard by the calm words. "You think you're in control," John continued, taking a small step forward. "But look at your crew. They're not behind you anymore, are they?" The leader's eyes darted to his men. Sure enough, most of them were hanging back, their faces a mix of uncertainty and doubt. Even the ones closest to him weren't making eye contact. "You've already lost," John said, his voice quieter now but no less impactful. "The only question is how much more you're willing to lose before you admit it." For a moment, it seemed like the leader might snap. His fists clenched, his body tense, his ego screaming for him to lash out. But something in John's gaze stopped him. It wasn't just the calm. It wasn't just the confidence. It was the weight of experience, the unshakable certainty of a man who had walked through fire and come out the other side. The leader took a step back. Then another. "You're lucky I don't have time for this," he muttered, his voice low and sullen. He turned to his crew, motioning for them to follow. "Let's go." The bikers hesitated, glancing at each other as if unsure whether to obey. But one by one, they began to move, filing toward the door. As the leader reached the exit, he paused, looking back at John one last time. "This isn't over," he said, his voice a mix of anger and shame. John didn't respond. He simply watched as the door swung shut behind them, leaving the cafe in silence once more. The leader let out a yelp, his bravado crumbling as John applied just enough pressure to keep him locked in place without breaking anything yet. "Let me go," the leader barked, his voice trembling. But John didn't flinch. The rest of the bikers froze, unsure of what to do. The leader had always been the one calling the shots, but now, seeing him subdued so effortlessly, doubt seeped into their ranks. "I gave you a chance," John said, his voice calm but laced with steel. "I told you to leave peacefully. But you didn't listen. And now you're going to learn why that was a mistake." With a controlled motion, John released the leader, shoving him forward just enough to send him stumbling into a chair. The leader turned back, clutching his arm, his face a mix of shock and rage. "You're dead, old man," he shouted, reaching into his jacket. The room gasped as he pulled out a knife, the blade catching the light. John didn't even blink. "I wouldn't do that if I were you," he said, his tone more of a warning than a threat. The leader hesitated, gripping the knife tightly but clearly uncertain. John took a step closer, his movements precise and deliberate. "You think that little blade scares me?" John asked, his voice low but carrying an edge that made the leader's confidence falter. "I've faced down armed men in alleys darker than your worst nightmares. Men who had more at stake than their egos. And do you know what happened to them?" The leader swallowed hard, but his bravado forced him to sneer. "What?" John leaned in just enough to make his words hit like a hammer. "They lost." In a flash, John's hand shot out, disarming the leader with a swift twist. The knife clattered to the floor, sliding out of reach. The leader stumbled back, clutching his wrist, his face pale. The bikers shifted uneasily, their fear now fully apparent. One of them, the scarred older biker who had tried to warn the leader earlier, raised his hands cautiously. "Hey, man," he said, his voice steady but cautious, "we don't want any more trouble. We'll leave." "Right, guys." The others murmured their agreement, nodding and backing toward the door. But John wasn't done yet. He turned to the scarred biker, his gaze sharp. "You have a choice," he said. "You can walk out of here and never come back. Or you can follow in his footsteps and see where it gets you." The scarred man nodded quickly. "We're leaving. We're done." The leader, however, wasn't ready to admit defeat. He lunged at John with a growl, his fists swinging wildly. John moved with the precision of a man who had spent decades honing his craft. He sidestepped the attack effortlessly, catching the leader's arm mid-swing and using his momentum to flip him onto the floor. The leader landed with a heavy thud, groaning in pain. "That's enough," John said, his voice commanding. "You've embarrassed yourself enough for one day." The leader glared up at him, his eyes blazing with hatred, but he didn't have the strength to get up. The other bikers took this as their cue. They rushed to the leader's side, dragging him to his feet. "Let's go," one of them muttered, his voice filled with urgency. As they shuffled toward the door, John spoke one last time, his words cutting through the tension like a knife. "If I ever see any of you around here again, it won't end with a warning. Do you understand?" The leader muttered something under his breath, but the scarred biker answered for him. "We understand. You won't see us again." And with that, the bikers were gone, the roar of their motorcycles fading into the distance. The cafe was silent for a moment, everyone too stunned to speak. Then, Slowly, the staff and patrons began to stir, murmuring among themselves. The waitress who had recognized John earlier approached him hesitantly. "Mr. Grant," she said softly, her voice trembling with a mix of awe and gratitude. "Thank you. I don't know what we would have done if you weren't here." John offered her a small smile, the tension in his face easing. "Just doing what needed to be done," he said simply. One of the customers, a middle-aged man sitting near the window, stood up and began to clap. It started slowly, hesitantly, but soon others joined in. The cafe erupted into applause, a wave of relief and admiration washing over the room. John held up a hand, signaling for quiet. "No need for that," he said. "I'm just an old man trying to enjoy his tea." The crowd chuckled nervously, but the respect in their eyes was undeniable. As the staff began cleaning up the mess, John picked up his coat and headed for the door. The waitress called after him. "Mr. Grant, wait." He paused, turning back to her. She hesitated, then asked, "Will we see you again?" John's expression softened. "Maybe," he said. "But if I did my job right, you won't need me to." And with that, he stepped out into the morning sun, leaving the quiet cafe on Willow Lane behind him. The cafe door swung shut, leaving the air heavy with the aftershock of what had just occurred. John turned to pick up his coat from the chair, his movements slow and deliberate. Around him, the patrons began to shift uneasily, their fear giving way to relief and, for some, curiosity. "Who is that guy?" a young man near the counter whispered, leaning toward the barista. The barista shook her head, her eyes still fixed on John. "Someone who clearly doesn't need help," she murmured. But not everyone was ready to let it go. A burly trucker seated near the window, who had remained silent during the entire ordeal, stood up, his hands planted firmly on the table. "Hey," he said, his voice gruff. "Those guys will probably come back with more friends. You sticking around for round two?" John paused mid-motion, his coat draped over one arm. He turned to face the trucker, his eyes calm but unyielding. "They won't be back," he said simply. The trucker frowned, unconvinced. "You sure about that? Guys like that don't just let things go." John shrugged, his expression unreadable. "They're not like you think," he said. "They follow fear more than reason. When someone stronger stands up, they back down. That's the way it always is." The trucker folded his arms, his brow furrowing. "And what happens when they don't? What happens when they decide to test how strong you really are?" John tilted his head slightly, considering the question. "They won't," he said after a moment. Then, with a faint smile, he added, "But if they do, I'll handle it." The trucker opened his mouth to argue further but stopped when he saw the way John's gaze bore into him, not threatening, but undeniably resolute. With a huff, the trucker sat back down, muttering something under his breath about crazy old men. The waitress, still clutching her notepad tightly to her chest, stepped forward again. "Mr. Grant," she began cautiously. "If it's not too much to ask, why didn't you just call the police?" John looked at her, his expression softening. "Because sometimes," he said, "you don't have time to wait. And sometimes, the best way to prevent more trouble is to deal with it right then and there." She nodded slowly, though it was clear she didn't fully understand. Nearby, a group of older patrons, regulars who had seen John at the cafe many times, whispered amongst themselves. One of them, a retired schoolteacher named Margaret, finally spoke up. "We've known you for years, John. You've always been so quiet, so kind." "I had no idea you were," she trailed off, searching for the right words. John chuckled softly, the sound almost self-deprecating. "What, someone with a past?" he offered. Margaret blushed but nodded. "We all have a past," John said. "Some of us just keep it quieter than others. The tension in the room began to ebb as the reality of the situation settled in. The bikers were gone, and John, who had seemed so ordinary just an hour ago, was anything but. But not everyone was content to let the matter drop. The scarred biker, who had hung back while his leader and crew had left in disgrace, suddenly pushed the door open again. He stood in the doorway, his hands raised in a gesture of peace. "Wait," he called out, his voice rough but steady. The cafe patrons froze, their conversations halting mid-sentence. John didn't look surprised. He turned slowly to face the man, his expression calm but watchful. "What do you want?" John asked. The scarred biker hesitated, his gaze flicking to the spilled tea and the broken cup on the floor. "I just wanted to say, we didn't know who you were," he said. "If we had, maybe things would have gone different." John raised an eyebrow. "You think respect only comes when someone earns a reputation?" The biker flinched slightly but didn't back down. "No," he admitted. "But it helps." The two men stared at each other for a long moment. Finally, the biker sighed and took a step forward, careful not to make any sudden movements. "You've got a reputation, man," he said. "Even if half the stories aren't true, it's clear you're someone who can back it up. I just wanted to say, I'm sorry for what happened here." John studied him for a moment, then nodded. "It's not me you owe an apology to," he said, gesturing to the cafe staff and patrons. "You disrupted their day. Made them feel unsafe in a place that should have been peaceful." The biker looked around, his shoulders sagging slightly. He nodded, then turned to the waitress. "I'm sorry," he said gruffly. "We shouldn't have come here. It won't happen again." The waitress, though still nervous, managed a small nod. "Thank you," she said quietly. The scarred biker turned back to John. "You've got my word," he said. "We'll stay away from here." John didn't respond right away. When he finally spoke, his voice was low but firm. "Make sure you keep it," he said. "For your sake." The biker nodded once, then turned and left without another word. The cafe settled into an uneasy quiet. Slowly, the staff began cleaning up the mess, while the patrons returned to their seats, though their conversations now buzzed with speculation about John's identity. John, meanwhile, bent down to pick up the shards of his broken teacup. The waitress hurried over. "Oh, no, Mr. Grant, you don't have to." But he waved her off gently. "It's fine," he said. "I'm used to cleaning up messes." She hesitated, then knelt beside him, helping gather the pieces. "Are you really the same John Grant who, you know, took down those gangs years ago?" she asked in a whisper. John smiled faintly. "I used to be," he said. "Now, I'm just someone who enjoys a good cup of tea." As he rose to his feet, the waitress looked up at him with a mixture of gratitude and respect. "Well," she said softly, "we're lucky to have you here." John didn't reply, but his smile deepened ever so slightly. With the cafe slowly returning to normal, John finally slipped on his coat and headed for the door. Just as he reached it, the barista called out to him. "Will you be back tomorrow, Mr. Grant?" He paused, his hand on the door handle. Without turning around, he replied, "That depends." "Will the tea be as good as it was today?" The barista laughed nervously. "It'll be better, I promise." John nodded, then stepped out into the crisp morning air. Within moments, the sound of police sirens wailed in the distance. The cafe, still in shock from the chaos that had unfolded just moments earlier, now found itself bracing for another wave of tension. It wasn't long before the door swung open again, this time with the unmistakable authority of law enforcement. 3 officers stepped in, their uniforms crisp and their movements swift. They surveyed the scene, quickly assessing the situation. The bikers, who had once stood tall with arrogance and defiance, now shifted uncomfortably as the realization hit them they were no longer in control. The officers wasted no time. They moved quickly, closing in on the group of bikers. One of the officers, a tall man with a square jaw, approached the leader first, his hand reaching for the biker's arm with practiced precision. "You're under arrest," he said in a calm, measured voice. The leader's eyes darted around, as if hoping for an escape, but he soon found himself surrounded by officers. His defiance faded, replaced by a mix of confusion and panic. John watched quietly, his expression unchanged. His earlier confrontation had done what needed to be done now, the law would take over. He didn't need to raise his hand anymore. The bikers were about to face justice, and it would be swift. The officer tightened the handcuffs around the leader's wrists, and the biker winced at the pressure. As he was pulled toward the door, the leader looked back over his shoulder, his eyes wide with disbelief. His voice trembled as he spoke, clearly trying to make sense of the situation. Who are you?" he stammered. "Why didn't you just call the cops earlier?" John stood up, dusting off his jacket with a casual movement. His eyes met the leader's, unwavering. For a moment, it seemed as if time slowed down, and everyone in the room, including the officers, held their breath. John's faint smile didn't fade. "Just a guy trying to enjoy his tea," he replied, his voice soft but firm, as if he were stating a simple fact. There was no anger in his tone, no need for further explanation. The leader's eyes widened even more, his mouth opening and closing as he searched for words. But none came. He was taken out of the cafe, his head down, his arrogance stripped away. The other bikers were quickly rounded up and led out one by one, their resistance melting away as they realized their fate had already been sealed. They hadn't just lost a confrontation, they had lost their grip on the power they thought they had. The officers took the bikers to their patrol cars, their demeanor professional but quick. The cafe was left in stunned silence. Inside, John remained calm, watching as the last of the bikers was escorted out. The air was thick with the buzz of quiet conversation, whispers starting to spread among the patrons and staff alike. Everyone was beginning to piece together what had happened. The old man, the unassuming retiree who had come in for a quiet cup of tea, wasn't just any retiree. He was a force to be reckoned with, someone who could handle trouble before it even reached a boiling point. One of the officers, a young woman with brown hair tied back in a tight ponytail, turned to John after the last biker had been placed in the police car. She approached him cautiously, her eyes scanning his face as if searching for something. "Mr. Grant," she said, her voice hesitant. You really took care of things in there. I didn't know you were still in town." John met her gaze, his expression still calm but now carrying a hint of recognition. "You should have known better than to think I'd be gone for good," he said softly, his voice holding just a trace of amusement. "Some things don't change." The officer nodded, her face still uncertain. She'd heard the stories, the legendary detective who had taken down entire criminal syndicates. John Grant was a name that carried weight in the local police department. He wasn't just some retiree, he was someone who had earned the respect of the law and had helped bring some of the worst criminals to justice in the past. She had seen his name on reports but had never met him face to face. Now, she understood why so many spoke of him with a mixture of admiration and awe. You don't look like the kind of guy who'd put up with this kind of nonsense," she said quietly, her eyes flicking toward the broken table and the shattered cup on the floor. "We should have been here sooner, but I guess you had everything under control." John smiled, a small but genuine smile that spoke volumes. "It wasn't the first time, and it won't be the last," he replied. "I've learned to deal with situations before they get out of hand." The officer nodded, a quiet respect settling between them. "I think we all owe you an apology for letting things get this far." John shook his head. "No need for that. Sometimes it takes a little disruption to remind people of the bigger picture." Just then, the cafe manager, a middle-aged woman named Susan, stepped forward. She had been watching the exchange between John and the officer, her face flushed with a mixture of confusion and relief. "I don't know what to say, John," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. "That could have gone a lot worse if you hadn't stepped in." John nodded, his smile soft but reassuring. "It's all right, Susan. No harm done. No one here was hurt. But the mess." He held up a hand, cutting her off gently. "That's nothing. We've seen worse." Susan hesitated, then walked over to the counter and poured John a fresh cup of tea. As she handed it to him, she added, "Well, you've certainly earned your tea today." John accepted the cup with a nod, his gaze flicking briefly to the patrons who were still watching him with a mix of awe and curiosity. He took a slow sip, savoring the warmth. It was a small, simple pleasure, one that he hadn't taken for granted. "Thank you," he said quietly, his voice sincere. Outside, the police cars began to pull away, the sounds of the city slowly returning to normal. The bikers were on their way to face the consequences of their actions. And John? He was back to enjoying his quiet morning. The cafe slowly returned to normal as well. The customers resumed their meals and coffee, though there was a new sense of respect in the air. The barista, who had been so nervous earlier, now flashed a quick smile at John. "Will you be back tomorrow, Mr. Grant?" she asked. John looked at her, his eyes twinkling slightly. "If the tea's as good as it was today," he said, his voice warm, "I'll be back." The barista smiled, relieved to see that the tension had lifted. "We'll make sure of it," she promised. As John stood to leave, he nodded at the others in the cafe, who offered him appreciative glances. He had done what needed to be done. He had served justice in his own way. It wasn't about the big showdown or the dramatic confrontation, it was about setting things right, quietly and without fanfare. And as he walked out the door, the world seemed just a little bit quieter, a little bit more at peace. The cafe, once again, settled into its usual rhythm. The hum of conversations picked up once more, but there was a noticeable shift in the atmosphere. The staff, who had been on edge just moments before, exchanged relieved smiles with each other. The quiet was no longer unsettling. In fact, it felt more comforting now. The tension had been lifted, and the cafe had returned to the peaceful place it had always been. The usual sounds of clinking cups, the whoosh of the espresso machine, and the soft chatter of customers filled the air once again. John, however, didn't linger long. He'd had his moment, and now it was time to move on. As he stood up from his seat, he caught the eyes of the waitress who had recognized him earlier. She had been watching him from behind the counter, still processing everything that had just unfolded. To her, it was like witnessing a legend in real life, something that most people only heard about in stories. John didn't speak to her immediately. Instead, he walked over to the counter and calmly placed his empty teacup down, his movements slow and deliberate. He didn't need to rush. He had already done what was needed. The bikers were gone, and the cafe was safe again. As he pulled out his wallet to pay, the waitress approached him. I don't know what to say," she said softly, her voice full of awe. You really took care of everything in there." John met her gaze, his expression still calm, his eyes holding a warmth that seemed to soften the room. "It wasn't anything special," he replied simply, but there was an air of quiet confidence in his voice. "Sometimes, it's just about knowing what to do in the right moment." The waitress blinked, trying to process his words. She had seen so many people come and go through the cafe, but she had never met anyone like him. He wasn't boastful or loud. He didn't need to make a scene. He had acted swiftly, decisively, and without the need for anyone's approval. That, in itself, made him stand out. John handed her the payment for his tea, his fingers brushing the smooth surface of the bill before he placed it in her hand. He smiled faintly, as if the entire event had been nothing more than a brief interruption in his otherwise calm day. Sometimes, it's not about making noise, he said, almost to himself, as though sharing a thought he had held for years. It's about knowing when to act. The words hung in the air for a moment. The waitress didn't respond immediately, but the weight of his message settled deep inside her. It was the kind of lesson that wasn't just about the cafe, or even the bikers. It was a lesson about life, about how real power isn't always about making a scene or forcing attention. It's about quiet strength, the kind that comes from knowing what to do when it matters most. John turned toward the door, the late morning sunlight spilling in through the windows, casting a golden glow over the cafe. He paused for just a second, his hand resting lightly on the door handle. He glanced back at the waitress, offering one last small, knowing smile. "Remember," he said softly, "sometimes the quietest voices speak the loudest." With that, he stepped out into the sunlight, the door closing gently behind him. The waitress stood still for a moment, watching him leave. The world outside seemed different now, brighter, somehow. She had witnessed a man with the kind of quiet strength she had only heard about in stories, someone who had seen much and experienced even more, but who knew when to stand firm and when to walk away. And inside the cafe, the patrons who had witnessed the events unfolding looked at each other, exchanging glances filled with new understanding. The atmosphere had shifted in a way that couldn't be explained. The chaos had been replaced by a sense of peace, a peace that felt earned, not given. In the back corner of the cafe, the old man with the sharp eyes and the quiet presence was no longer just a retired detective. He had become something more. He had become a reminder that not all strength comes with noise, and not all heroes wear capes or make dramatic entrances. Some heroes simply act when the moment calls for it. They don't wait for applause or recognition. They don't need a crowd. They act when it matters, and in doing so, they change the world around them in ways most people will never see. The bikers had been a disruption. A loud, threatening force that had come into the cafe, breaking the peace. But they left knowing their place without a fight, without a struggle, but with the undeniable lesson that not everything could be dominated with loudness and fear. Sometimes, it was the quiet presence that would stop them in their tracks. And that was enough. John Grant had made sure of that. As he walked down the street, the warmth of the sun on his face, John felt no need to reflect on the day's events. It was just another moment in a life filled with moments like these. Quiet victories. Peaceful justice. He didn't need the spotlight. He didn't need the applause. He had done what he set out to do, what was right. And as he disappeared around the corner, out of sight of the cafe, the story of that morning would live on in the minds of the patrons who had been there. They would remember the quiet man who had faced down a group of loud bikers without so much as raising his voice. They would tell the story of the man who hadn't needed to fight to win. And they would remember the lesson that John had shared, the lesson that would stay with them for a long time. Sometimes, it's not about making noise. It's about knowing when to act.